What if the miracle you were taught to regard as absolutely unprecedented was not unprecedented at all? What if the image of a divine figure entering death and returning from it had already appeared for thousands of years before the first Christian gospel was written? For most Christians, the resurrection is not merely one doctrine among many. It is the central pillar supporting the entire structure. Remove it, and everything built upon it begins to collapse. The authority of Jesus, the promise of salvation, the hope of eternal life, and the claim that Christianity reveals something no earlier religion had ever known. The power of that structure depends heavily on one word: unique. You were taught that one man entered the grave and returned in a way no god, prophet, king, or savior had ever done before. You were told that this event separated Jesus from every religious figure who preceded him. It was presented not merely as extraordinary, but as historically isolated, a divine signature stamped onto one person, in one place, at one moment in time. But a serious mind cannot stop at the word unique. It must ask whether the word is true. And the moment we examine the religious world surrounding early Christianity, the certainty begins to weaken. Egypt had stories of a murdered god restored after death. Greece worshipped divine figures who were dismembered and reborn. Mesopotamia mourned a shepherd god who descended beneath the earth and returned with the seasons. Anatolia, Syria, Phoenicia, and Canaan all preserved variations of the same structure. A god dies. The world grieves. Nature becomes barren. The god returns. Life begins again. This pattern did not appear once. It emerged repeatedly across different civilizations, languages, climates, and centuries. The names changed. The costumes changed. The rituals changed. But beneath those differences, the emotional machinery remained remarkably familiar. And that machinery did not originally begin with theology. It began with soil. Before resurrection became a doctrine about the destiny of the soul, it was an observation about the destiny of the seed. A farmer placed grain beneath the earth. It disappeared into darkness. Its former shape dissolved. To anyone who did not understand the process, it appeared lost. Then the season changed. The ground opened. Green life emerged from what had been buried. To ancient people, this was not an abstract scientific cycle. It was a visible mystery repeated every year before their eyes. The field became a grave, and the harvest became a return from death. Human beings saw the seed vanish and reappear, and they turned that natural rhythm into sacred narrative. The dying god was winter. The returning god was spring. The burial was planting. The resurrection was harvest. This does not automatically prove that one religion simply copied another word for word. History is rarely that mechanical. Ideas travel, combine, change, and adapt. But it does mean that the basic religious pattern existed long before Christianity claimed it as exclusive. The more uncomfortable question, therefore, is no longer merely whether Jesus rose. The deeper question is why generations of believers were taught that no comparable story had existed before him. To examine that question honestly, we must place 6 ancient figures before us. Not rumors, not vague similarities collected from modern imagination. 6 divine beings whose myths, rituals, and seasonal meanings developed before Christianity became the dominant faith of the Roman world. The first body belongs to Egypt, Osiris. More than 2,000 years before the time associated with Jesus, Osiris stood at the center of Egyptian religious consciousness. He was not simply a god who happened to die. His death, restoration, and reign beyond the grave shaped how Egyptians understood mortality itself. In the most widely remembered form of the myth, Osiris rules with justice. His brother Set, consumed by jealousy, devises a trap. During a banquet, Set presents a magnificent chest and promises it to whoever fits perfectly inside it. Osiris enters. The lid is sealed. The chest is thrown into the Nile. Death arrives through betrayal. But the story does not end there. Isis, the wife of Osiris, searches for his body and eventually recovers it. Set discovers what she has done and attacks again. This time, he cuts the body into pieces and scatters them across Egypt. The image is brutal. Divine unity shattered. A sacred body distributed across the land. Isis travels from place to place, gathering what remains. She recovers nearly every part, but not all of them. One portion has disappeared into the river and cannot be retrieved. Through ritual, devotion, and magical restoration, she reconstructs the body of Osiris. He returns. Yet honesty requires precision here. Osiris does not resume his former earthly throne as though nothing occurred. He does not walk casually through Egyptian cities, returning to ordinary life. His restoration transforms him into something else. He becomes ruler of the underworld. He becomes judge of the dead. His victory does not erase death. It gives him authority within death. This distinction matters. Similarity is not identity, and exaggeration weakens any argument that depends on evidence. But the essential pattern remains unmistakable. A divine ruler is murdered, his body is restored, and his passage through death becomes the foundation of hope for those who follow him. For the Egyptian believer, the fate of Osiris was not merely an entertaining tale about a distant god. It was a model for the fate of the human dead. In Egyptian funerary language, the deceased could be identified directly with Osiris. The dead person became Osiris, followed by his or her own name. The meaning was clear. Because the god had successfully entered death and gained a new form of existence, the follower could hope to participate in the same victory. The divine journey became the believer's journey. The god had passed through the grave first. The human being would follow. Does that logic sound entirely unfamiliar? A god overcomes death. Those united with him receive eternal life. A sacred drama becomes a promise for every believer. And beneath this spiritual structure, once again, we find agriculture. Osiris was closely associated with vegetation, fertility, and the renewal of the land. Egyptian images often represented him with green skin, the color of growth returning after barrenness. During religious ceremonies, worshippers created forms known as Osiris beds. These were shaped representations of the god filled with earth and planted with grain. The seeds were watered, shoots emerged from the body. The god appeared to rise in green life. No explanation could make the symbolism more visible. The corpse of Osiris became the cultivated field. Burial and planting became the same gesture. The growing grain was not merely food. It was a divine sign that life could emerge from apparent destruction. Every year the Nile receded, leaving behind fertile soil. Every year grain returned. Every year Egypt watched death retreat before renewal. The natural cycle became theology. The calendar became sacred drama. During the month of Koyak, rituals reenacted the loss and restoration of Osiris. There was mourning, searching, lamentation, and then celebration. Grief came first. Joy followed. The god was lost, and then the god was restored. Long before Christian communities gathered to commemorate a divine death and celebrate a divine return, Egypt was already moving through a sacred season of sorrow, followed by triumph. This is the first figure before us. A murdered god, a reconstructed body, a ruler beyond death, a promise of continuing life for those joined to him, and grain growing from the shape of his corpse. But Osiris is only the beginning. The next figure carries the pattern into Greece, where death, dismemberment, wine, initiation, and divine rebirth become part of a mystery religion, promising transformation beyond the grave. The second body belongs to Greece, Dionysus. Most people encounter Dionysus as the god of wine, intoxication, theater, celebration, and uncontrolled emotion. He is often reduced to an image of pleasure, grapes, music, dancing, and ecstatic festivals. But beneath that familiar surface lies a darker religious tradition. In the Orphic version of his story, Dionysus is not simply born. He is born, destroyed, and born again. As a divine child, he attracts the hostility of the Titans. They approach him through deception, distracting him with toys and reflective objects. While his attention is captured, they attack, they tear him apart, they consume his body. Once again, the divine form is dismembered. The same disturbing image we encountered in the myth of Osiris appears in another civilization, sacred unity, broken into pieces, the god passing through violent destruction before restoration becomes possible. Yet something remains. The heart survives. From this surviving heart, Dionysus is restored to life. For this reason, later traditions remember him as the twice-born god, a being whose identity is marked not only by divine birth, but by return after destruction. His story contains another form of rebirth as well. His mortal mother, Semele, dies before completing her pregnancy. Zeus rescues the unborn Dionysus and carries him within his own body until the child is ready to emerge. He is born from a woman who dies. He is preserved within a god. he enters life twice. Every version circles the same paradox. Life appears precisely where death should have ended it. In Orphic thought, the destruction of Dionysus also becomes connected to the condition of humanity. After the Titans consume the god, Zeus destroys them. From their remains, human beings are said to emerge. Human nature, therefore, carries a divided inheritance. Humanity comes from the violent Titans, but it also contains something of the god they consumed. The human being is imagined as a mixture of the fallen and the divine, the destructive and the redeemable. Centuries before Christian theology developed its own language of inherited corruption, divine participation, and salvation, Greek mystery religion was already working with a related psychological pattern. Something within the human person is damaged, something within the human person is sacred, and liberation requires union with the god. This was not simply mythology told for amusement. It became a path of salvation. The mystery cults connected with Dionysus and Orphic teaching offered initiates a hope extending beyond ordinary civic religion. Public worship might protect the city or honor the gods, but initiation promised something intensely personal, a better fate after death. Secret knowledge, ritual purification, and identification with the divine figure were believed to prepare the soul for what awaited beyond the visible world. Archaeologists have discovered small gold tablets placed in graves throughout the Greek world. These tablets contained instructions for the dead. They told the soul what to say, which path to follow, what dangers to avoid, and how to identify itself before the powers of the underworld. The deceased was not expected to wander blindly. The initiate carried a map. In some of these texts, the soul declares that it has escaped the mortal condition and entered a divine state. The exact beliefs varied across regions and periods, but the promise was unmistakable. Initiation into the sacred mystery could transform the individual's destiny after death. A religious community existed centuries before Christianity in which believers were buried with instructions for the next world and confidence that participation in a god could free them from ordinary mortality. Then there is the wine. Wine is not incidental to Dionysus. It is his element, his gift, and in ritual terms, an extension of his presence. The vine appears lifeless after it is cut back. During winter it seems reduced to dead wood. Then, with the return of the season, leaves emerge, fruit develops, and the substance that produces wine flows again. The vine itself becomes a lesson in apparent death and renewal. When worshippers drank wine in Dionysian ritual, they were not merely enjoying an ordinary beverage. They were receiving what belonged to the god. They were taking his sacred power into themselves, participating in the altered state associated with his presence. The boundary between worshipper and deity became less stable. The human being drank. The god entered. The individual was joined to a divine life, expressed through the vine. We must be careful not to flatten every religious ritual into the same event. The Dionysian mysteries were not Christian communion, and Christian communion was not simply Dionysian worship under another name. Historical influence cannot be proven by visual resemblance alone, but resemblance still matters. A vegetation god dies and is reborn. His followers seek union with him. Wine serves as a sacred medium of participation. Initiation promises a transformed existence beyond death. The argument is not that every detail was copied in a straight line. The argument is that the symbolic architecture had already been constructed. The mold existed. Christianity did not enter a world unfamiliar with dead and returning gods, sacred meals, divine participation, ritual rebirth, or salvation after death. It entered a world already crowded with them, and now the pattern moves farther east, into a civilization older than Greece. The third body is Tammuz, known to the Sumerians as Dumuzi. His name appears on some of the earliest written tablets produced by human civilization. Long before Bethlehem, long before Athens reached its height, and long before Rome became an empire, people in Mesopotamia were already mourning a divine shepherd who entered the underworld and returned according to the rhythm of the year. Tammuz is the husband of Inanna, the great Sumerian goddess later known in Babylonian tradition as Ishtar. The story begins not with his descent, but hers. Inanna resolves to enter the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister. To reach the underworld, she must pass through 7 gates. At each gate, an ornament, garment, or symbol of authority is removed from her. Piece by piece, her power disappears. Crown, jewelry, clothing, status, protection. By the time she stands before the throne of death, she has nothing left. The journey strips her not only physically but symbolically. She enters death without the signs by which the upper world recognizes her. There she is judged. She dies. Her body is suspended like an object, powerless in the kingdom below. Eventually, assistance comes from the world above, and Inanna is restored. But the underworld follows its own necessity. No one leaves without consequence. If she returns to the living world, someone must take her place. A substitute is required. When Inanna returns, she finds Tammuz seated in splendor rather than mourning her absence. In anger, she identifies him as the one who will descend. Her husband is seized. The shepherd god is taken below. Later traditions develop the arrangement into a seasonal division. Tammuz remains in the underworld for part of the year and returns for another part. When he is absent, vegetation disappears. The earth dries. Fertility retreats. When he returns, life returns with him. The agricultural meaning is almost impossible to miss. The shepherd god beneath the ground is the buried vitality of the land. His absence is drought. His return is growth. The year itself becomes his biography. Yet someone might still say that these are distant pagan stories with no meaningful relationship to biblical religion. The Hebrew scriptures make that argument difficult to maintain. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes practices that he regards as abominations occurring near the Jerusalem temple. Among them are women sitting and mourning for Tammuz. Consider what that means. The cult of a dying and seasonally returning god was not located only in some remote Mesopotamian sanctuary. Its ritual mourning had entered the religious environment of Jerusalem itself. Women grieved for the dead god. They awaited the change of season. The prophet condemned the practice precisely because it was present, visible, and influential. The tradition from which Christianity later emerged did not grow in complete isolation from resurrection symbolism. It lived beside competing cults. It argued against them. It absorbed their vocabulary, rejected their gods, and defined itself in opposition to practices already familiar in the region. Even the name Tammuz survived. The fourth month of the Jewish calendar still bears it. A god officially rejected by biblical theology remains preserved in the calendar's language, like a fossil embedded in stone. A forgotten religious world continues to speak through the name of a month. So the third figure stands before us. An ancient shepherd god, a descent into death, women mourning his absence, a seasonal return, a cult acknowledged within the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Three figures now occupy the table, but the fourth will bring the pattern into the heart of Rome, where a dead young god, a grieving divine mother, blood, rebirth, and a spring festival existed in direct competition with the developing Christian message. The fourth figure is Attis, and this is where careless comparisons often become loudest. Attis is frequently presented as an exact pagan copy of Jesus, born of a virgin, crucified, buried, and resurrected on the third day. Many of those simplified claims go beyond what the surviving evidence can securely establish. The more responsible approach is not to exaggerate. It is to examine what the tradition actually contained. Attis was associated with Cybele, the great mother goddess whose worship originated in Anatolia. Her cult was officially brought to Rome in 204 BCE, during a period of crisis in the Roman Republic. That date matters. The cult was not a late invention designed after Christianity had already conquered the empire. Cybele and Attis were present in Rome generations before the birth of Jesus. Attis appears as a beautiful young shepherd loved by the goddess. His myth survives in several forms, but the central event is violent. Driven into madness, he mutilates himself beneath a pine tree and dies. The pine becomes sacred. Cybele mourns. The young divine beloved lies dead beneath the tree. The image of a grieving mother and a lost son immediately creates emotional parallels for anyone familiar with later Christian art. But images alone do not prove direct borrowing. Human grief naturally produces repeated forms. A mother bends over a dead son because that is what grief looks like. A sacred tree appears because trees already carried religious meaning across ancient cultures. The stronger comparison emerges from the ritual calendar. During the Roman imperial period, the cult of Attis developed an elaborate spring observance. Its ceremonies unfolded across several days near the vernal equinox, precisely when the natural world moved from winter toward renewed growth. A sacred pine was cut and brought into the sanctuary. The image of Attis was attached to it. The god was carried in death. Mourning followed. There was a day of blood, in which priests and worshippers entered states of intense lamentation and ritual injury. The emotional atmosphere was not gentle remembrance. It was grief made physical. Then the mood changed. The Hilaria arrived the day of rejoicing. Sorrow gave way to celebration. The loss of the god was followed by joy, connected with his preservation, renewal, or restored divine presence. The pattern is familiar: a sacred death, a period of mourning, blood, a shift from grief into triumph, a festival of joy placed in the season of returning life. Was this exactly the Christian Holy Week in pagan form? No. But anyone claiming that the Roman world had never seen a springtime sequence of divine death, grief, and celebration before Christianity would have difficulty defending that claim. There was also the Taurobolium, a ritual associated with the cult of Cybele. Its exact form and meaning changed over time, and popular descriptions sometimes make it more theatrical than the evidence allows. In later accounts, an initiate or priest stood beneath a platform while a bull was sacrificed above. Blood descended onto the participant. Inscriptions connected the rite with purification, renewal, or being reborn for a period of years or even eternally. The symbolic language is striking. Blood cleanses. The participant descends. The participant emerges transformed. The old condition is left behind. A new condition begins. Again, this does not demonstrate a simple copy-and-paste relationship. Religions use blood because blood is universally associated with life, injury, sacrifice, kinship, and death. Descent and emergence appear in initiation rites because they express transformation in a form the body can experience. But when Christian preachers later spoke of being washed in blood, dying to the former self, and being born again, those words entered a Roman culture in which ritual purification and rebirth through sacrificial blood were not incomprehensible ideas. The audience already possessed symbolic categories for them. This is where chronological honesty becomes essential. The clearest literary statements describing Attis as fully restored from death are relatively late. Some belong to the Christian era. Therefore, it would be irresponsible to claim without qualification that every element of the later Attis festival was already fixed centuries before Christianity. But this uncertainty does not eliminate the comparison. It changes its meaning. Rather than imagining Christianity copying a finished pagan script from centuries earlier, we may be looking at religious traditions developing beside one another in the same empire. Christians and devotees of Cybele lived in the same cities, used overlapping language, competed for converts, and interpreted one another through conflict. Two traditions occupied the same streets. Both emphasized salvation. Both knew sacred blood. Both used the language of rebirth. Both moved through mourning toward joy. Both placed enormous significance on the fate of a divine or semi-divine figure. The resemblance became obvious even to early Christian writers. Justin Martyr and other church fathers did not respond by saying that pagan mysteries had no similarities to Christian rites. Instead, they argued that demonic powers had anticipated or imitated Christian truth in order to mislead humanity. Consider the logic of that defense. The resemblance was not dismissed. It was explained. The pagan ceremony, they claimed, resembled the Christian mystery because hostile spiritual forces had planted counterfeit versions in advance. Whatever one thinks of that explanation, it reveals something important. Early Christians were aware that their rituals and narratives existed in a religious world full of parallels. They did not inhabit an empty symbolic landscape. They entered a crowded marketplace of salvation. People in Rome could hear Christians speak of sacred blood, new birth, eternal life, death overcome, and union with a Savior, and those listeners could compare such language with other mysteries they already knew. The competition was not theoretical. It was cultural, political, and emotional. Which community offered purification? Which god promised protection? Which initiation secured the soul? Which sacred death carried the greatest power? Which story could transform fear into hope? Over time, Christianity won the imperial contest. Its rivals diminished, their temples closed, and their texts survived only in fragments or hostile descriptions. Once one tradition became dominant, the similarities could be forgotten or reclassified as meaningless coincidences. The victor gained the power to define what counted as revelation and what counted as superstition. There is also a geographical irony often used in arguments about Cybele and Attis. The Vatican Hill was not originally Christian territory. Before the construction of the great Christian basilicas, the region contained burial grounds and sanctuaries connected with several Roman cults. Evidence of worship associated with Cybele and the Taurobolium has been found in the broader Vatican area. It would be simplistic to imagine a Christian church built directly on top of one pagan altar in a neat act of replacement. Ancient cities are layered, crowded, and continuously reused, but the symbolism remains powerful. A place that would eventually become one of Christianity's most important centers once belonged to a religious environment where other gods, other sacrifices, and other promises of purification were practiced. The ground itself remembers what institutions prefer to forget. Attis therefore stands as the fourth figure, a young shepherd associated with a great mother, a violent death beneath a sacred tree, a season of mourning, ritual blood, language of purification and rebirth, a spring celebration that developed alongside Christianity within the same Roman world. Not an exact duplicate in every historical detail, but not a distant and irrelevant stranger either. The fifth figure takes us westward from Mesopotamia through Phoenicia and into Greece. His name means Lord. He dies young. Women mourn him. Flowers rise from his blood. He descends below and returns according to the season. His name is Adonis. Adonis begins with a title rather than a personal name. The word comes from the Semitic root Adon, meaning Lord or Master. Before Christians called Jesus Lord, communities along the eastern Mediterranean already used the same title in connection with a beautiful dying god whose absence brought mourning and whose return was linked with renewal. This does not mean the title belonged exclusively to Adonis. Lord is one of the most natural religious titles human beings can produce. Kings are lords. Masters are lords. Gods become lords because the word expresses authority and dependence, but the repetition still deserves attention. A divine lord dies. His followers mourn. Life returns. Adonis did not appear in isolation. He is closely related to the older Mesopotamian figure Tammuz. As stories move through trade routes, migrations, conquests, and cultural exchange, gods crossed borders. Their names changed. Local landscapes reshaped their myths. New deities merged with older ones. The pattern traveled. What Mesopotamia called Dumuzi, or Tammuz, became associated in Syria and Phoenicia with a figure later known to the Greeks as Adonis. The Greek story presents him as a young man of extraordinary beauty. His birth is connected with the myrrh tree, from which he emerges. Aphrodite loves him, but his life ends violently during a hunt when a wild boar attacks and kills him. His blood falls upon the earth. From it grows the anemone. Once again, death becomes vegetation. The divine body does not simply decay. It enters the natural world and reappears in botanical form. Aphrodite mourns him, yet he does not belong permanently to the dead. In later forms of the myth, an arrangement is made in which Adonis spends part of the year in the underworld and part in the world above. His movement resembles the agricultural year. He descends. The land loses vitality. He returns. Growth begins again. The sacred drama transforms the seasonal cycle into a relationship between love and death. Nature is no longer merely cold weather, followed by warmth. It becomes the separation and reunion of divine lovers. This is one reason myths survive. They do not only explain external events, they give emotional form to natural necessity. Winter becomes grief. Spring becomes reunion. The human mind sees the land change and interprets the change through its own deepest experiences. Love, loss, longing, and return. The festival of Adonis made the agricultural meaning visible. During the Adonia, women planted small containers with fast-growing seeds. These gardens of Adonis sprouted quickly, but possessed shallow roots. They flourished for a brief moment and then withered beneath the heat. The entire life of the god unfolded inside a pot. Rapid beauty, sudden death, lamentation. The ritual did not conceal its connection to vegetation. It enacted it. The worshippers watched the shoots appear, saw them die, and mourned the divine youth through the dying plants. The garden became a miniature theater of mortality. What appears intensely alive may be fragile. What grows quickly may have no depth. Beauty does not protect life from necessity. Adonis embodied not only seasonal return, but the sorrow of impermanence. In the Phoenician city of Byblos, the cult acquired another dramatic sign. During certain seasons, Waters flowing from the mountains could become reddish from mineral-rich soil carried by rain. Religious imagination interpreted the color as the blood of Adonis. The river itself seemed to mourn. Ancient writers described public lamentation followed by announcements that the god had been found alive or restored. Once more, the sequence appears: death, blood, women mourning, a divine return, the renewal of vegetation. And there is myrrh. The story connects Adonis with a myrrh tree. In Christian tradition, myrrh appears among the gifts brought to the infant Jesus, and later as a substance associated with burial. No single shared object proves direct dependence. Myrrh was valuable, fragrant, medicinal, and widely used in religious and funerary contexts. Its appearance in multiple traditions is historically understandable, but symbols accumulate meaning. Myrrh links birth to death, fragrance to burial, sacred value to mortality. When the gospel places myrrh near Jesus, it places him within a symbolic world already ancient. Adonis is therefore not a completely separate invention, but an example of how one religious structure could migrate across civilizations. The same basic god crosses linguistic borders and receives new poetry. The fifth figure lies before us, a god called Lord, a beautiful youth killed in the natural world, a goddess in mourning, blood becoming flowers, a divided existence between the underworld and the earth, a festival in which seeds grow and die as the body of the god. The sixth and final figure does not come from distant Egypt, Greece, or Rome. He comes from Canaan. He is Baal, the great rival of the God of Israel. The word Baal also means lord, owner, or master. It could function as a title for several local deities, though the Ugaritic texts present a powerful storm god, often called Baal-Hadad. More than 1,000 years before Christianity, poems written on clay tablets told of his conflict with Mot. Mot is not merely a god who causes death. His name means death. The story therefore stages a confrontation between the power that brings rain and fertility and death itself. Baal is the storm. He brings water to the fields. He makes agricultural life possible. Mot is dryness, barrenness, consumption, and the grave. Death swallows Baal. The storm god disappears into the underworld. Immediately, the land suffers. Rain ceases. The earth cracks. Fertility collapses. Here again, divine death and ecological disaster are the same event described in two languages. The god dies because the rain ends. The rain ends because the god dies. Myth and season mirror one another. Anat, Baal's sister and ally, searches for him. She confronts Mot with extraordinary violence. The poem describes her cutting, burning, grinding, and scattering death. The imagery resembles the processing of grain. Cut, winnow, burn, grind, scatter. Death is treated like a crop at harvest. This is one of the clearest moments in the entire pattern. The myth does not merely hint at agriculture. Its violence is agricultural. Death is harvested. Once Mot is defeated, Baal returns, and rain returns with him. The earth becomes fertile again. The god rises because the storm season returns. The land lives because its Lord lives. Baal was not unknown to the biblical authors. He appears repeatedly as the chief religious rival of Yahweh. The Hebrew scriptures describe Israelites worshiping Baal, building altars to him, and provoking prophetic condemnation. On Mount Carmel, Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal in a contest over divine power. The conflict is not simply between belief and unbelief. It is between competing religious systems claiming authority over rain, fertility, sacrifice, and national identity. Baal was close. He was worshipped in the same region. His followers cultivated the same soil. His myths circulated among neighboring peoples. The world that eventually produced Christianity had spent centuries arguing with a religious tradition in which a lord connected with rain was swallowed by death and later restored. This does not prove that the gospel writers sat with Ugaritic tablets and deliberately reconstructed Baal as Jesus. That is not the point. The point is that the cultural soil was already fertile with death and return symbolism. The seed had been planted repeatedly. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Attis in Anatolia and Rome, Adonis in Phoenicia and Greece, Baal in Canaan. 6 figures, 3 continents, thousands of years, different myths, different rituals, different degrees of similarity, but one recurring emotional structure. A divine being disappears into death. The world becomes barren or enters mourning. The divine figure is restored, renewed, rediscovered, or returned. Followers gain hope from that victory. Now the central question changes. We are no longer asking merely whether similarities exist. They clearly do. We must ask why the human mind creates this pattern again and again. Why does it turn the seasons into divine biography? Why does it imagine the seed as a corpse? Why does it transform harvest into resurrection? Why does it place its hope for personal survival inside the return of a god? To answer that, we turn to Baruch Spinoza not because he can tell us which ancient story is historically true, but because he can explain the psychological mechanism that produces religious certainty under the pressure of fear. Baruch Spinoza lived in the 17th century, far removed from the temples of Osiris, the mysteries of Dionysus, and the festivals of Attis. Yet his philosophy provides a lens through which all 6 stories can be examined as expressions of one human condition. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam into a Portuguese Jewish community shaped by exile, commerce, tradition, and religious discipline. As a young man, he began questioning ideas that his community considered essential. His questioning did not remain private. He was expelled. The condemnation separated him from the religious world into which he had been born, but it did not silence him. He chose intellectual independence over the security of belonging. He lived quietly, supported himself in part through work connected with lens-making, and developed one of the most radical philosophical systems in Western thought. The symbolism of the lens is difficult to ignore. Spinoza spent his life grinding instruments intended to make vision clearer, while his philosophy attempted to do the same for the mind. His central claim was revolutionary. God is not a human-like ruler standing outside the universe. God is not a monarch seated beyond nature, issuing commands, becoming angry, changing plans, interrupting natural laws, or rewarding one tribe while punishing another. For Spinoza, God and nature refer to the same infinite reality. Everything that exists is within this reality. Nothing stands outside it. Human beings are not exceptions to nature. Human thoughts, desires, fears, political institutions, religious beliefs, and bodily actions arise within the same order of causes as storms, trees, rivers, and planets. This destroys the ordinary idea of miracle. A miracle is usually imagined as an event in which God interrupts nature. But if God is not separate from nature, then God cannot invade nature from outside. Nature cannot violate itself. An event may surprise us because we do not understand its cause, but surprise is not proof that causality has been suspended. Ignorance creates the appearance of miracle. Understanding restores the event to the order of nature. From this perspective, the literal return of a dead body does not prove divine power by breaking natural law. It presents a narrative that must be examined according to evidence, causes, symbolism, and human psychology. But Spinoza's importance here is not simply that he rejects miracles. His deeper contribution is explaining why people need them. Why do human beings repeatedly build stories in which death is defeated? Why does the same pattern emerge in societies separated by geography and language? Why do communities turn seasonal cycles into promises of personal survival? Spinoza's answer begins with fear. Human beings know that they are vulnerable. They become sick. They lose people they love. Crops fail. Children die. Empires collapse. The body weakens. The future cannot be controlled. Life is surrounded by forces that exceed individual power. When people do not understand the causes governing events, they experience uncertainty not as a neutral absence of knowledge, but as emotional danger. They swing between hope and fear. When circumstances appear favorable, they hope. When circumstances turn against them, they fear. Because they do not know what will happen, they search for signs. A storm becomes a warning. A successful harvest becomes approval. A disease becomes punishment. A coincidence becomes a message. The imagination fills the space left by knowledge. This is how superstition develops. It is not born because human beings are uniquely foolish. It is born because uncertainty is painful. The frightened mind prefers an explanation it can emotionally manage over a reality it cannot predict. A god who controls the weather may be terrifying, but at least the god can be approached. A ritual can be performed. An offering can be given. A command can be obeyed. The universe becomes negotiable. This is psychologically powerful. Random suffering becomes punishment, and punishment implies a judge. If there is a judge, perhaps the sentence can be reduced. The person gains the illusion of control. The resurrection story offers an answer to the greatest uncertainty of all: death. Human beings watch others disappear. They understand that the same end approaches them. The imagination resists the possibility that the self, with its memories, loves, plans, and internal voice, could simply cease. Then the human being looks at nature. Winter kills the field. Spring restores it. The moon disappears and returns. The sun descends and rises. The seed is buried and emerges. The vine is cut and grows again. From these observations, the mind constructs an analogy. If nature returns, perhaps I will return. If the seed survives burial, perhaps the body survives the grave. If the God representing the field descends and rises, perhaps those united with him will do the same. The conclusion does not arise from stupidity. It arises from a profound emotional need combined with a visible natural pattern. The 6 gods are therefore not necessarily 6 copies of one historical event. They may be 6 expressions produced by similar causes. The same kind of mind confronts the same kind of fear while observing the same cycles of nature. Similar causes produce similar symbols. This is Spinoza's world. Nothing appears without causes. The resemblance between myths need not be explained by a secret universal revelation or a perfectly traceable line of plagiarism. Human nature itself can generate repetition. Imagine 6 communities standing before different fields. Each watches seed disappear into darkness. Each depends on rain. Each fears famine. Each buries its dead. Each longs for continuity. Why should we be surprised if each creates a sacred story connecting burial with return? The names differ because the cultures differ. The structure repeats because the fear repeats. This leads to a more disturbing conclusion. The religious story does not merely comfort fear. It can organize it. Whoever claims authority over the promise of survival gains power over those afraid to die. A priesthood that controls access to the God can control access to hope. An institution that defines salvation can also define damnation. The same doctrine that reassures the believer can make the believer dependent. Hope and fear begin to reinforce one another. You are promised eternal life if you obey. You are threatened with loss if you refuse. The more terrified you become, the more valuable the promise appears. The more valuable the promise appears, the more authority you grant to those who administer it. This mechanism can operate even when the people involved are sincere. A priest may genuinely believe the doctrine. A parent may teach it out of love. A community may enforce it because it fears moral collapse. Spinoza does not need to imagine a secret conspiracy. Systems of control can emerge naturally from shared fear. A population demands certainty. An institution supplies certainty. The institution receives obedience in return. This is why Spinoza's analysis remains dangerous. He does not merely ask whether a doctrine is true. He asks what emotion sustains it. What fear makes it necessary? What hope makes it attractive? What authority benefits from its acceptance? And what happens to the person who begins to understand the mechanism? For Spinoza, freedom does not begin when someone gives you a new belief. It begins when you understand why you believed. This distinction is essential. A person may leave one religion and immediately enter another system of unquestioned certainty. The names change, but the emotional structure survives. The former believer rejects a church and begins obeying a political movement, a spiritual teacher, an online ideology, or an identity that cannot tolerate doubt. The object changes. The dependence remains. This is why Spinoza does not liberate the mind by offering a seventh savior. He does not replace Jesus with Osiris. He does not command the listener to worship nature as though nature were another supernatural personality demanding praise. He does not exchange one sacred book for a different sacred book and ask for the same submission. He exposes causality. Once the cause of a belief becomes visible, the belief loses some of its unconscious force. Suppose you feel intense anger toward another person. While the anger remains unexplained, it seems completely justified and almost independent. You believe the other person simply deserves your hatred, but if you begin tracing the causes, the emotion changes. Perhaps the anger comes from humiliation. The humiliation comes from fear of appearing weak. That fear comes from an identity built around approval. The need for approval comes from earlier experiences of rejection. The chain continues. Understanding does not automatically erase the emotion, but it transforms your relationship to it. What seemed like a free and righteous reaction becomes an event with causes. You can examine it. You can anticipate it. You can act with greater intelligence. The same applies to religious fear. While the fear of damnation remains hidden beneath layers of doctrine, it feels like a direct perception of reality. The person says, "I believe because it is true." But when the causes are examined, another possibility appears. Perhaps the belief was installed during childhood, before critical reasoning developed. Perhaps trusted adults associated doubt with danger. Perhaps belonging to the family depended on agreement. Perhaps death seemed unbearable without a promise of reunion. Perhaps guilt made punishment feel deserved. Perhaps uncertainty produced anxiety, and doctrine offered relief. Again, understanding the cause does not automatically prove the belief false. It does something more fundamental. It prevents the emotion from disguising itself as evidence. Fear may explain why an idea feels necessary. It does not establish that the idea is true. Hope may explain why a promise feels beautiful. It does not establish that the promise corresponds to reality. For Spinoza, a person remains passive when he is driven by causes he does not understand. He becomes more active when knowledge allows him to participate consciously in what moves him. This is his unusual definition of freedom. Freedom does not mean escaping causality. Nothing escapes causality. You did not choose your genes, birthplace, language, early experiences, body, historical period, or most of the events that shaped your emotional life. Even the thoughts you call your own arise from previous conditions. The clock hand believes it moves independently because it cannot see the mechanism behind the face. Human beings often make the same mistake. We experience desire but not the causes of desire. We experience choice but not the complete chain that produced the choice. We experience belief but not the history that made the belief emotionally necessary. Spinoza's freedom is not the fantasy of becoming uncaused. It is the increasing ability to understand causes and act from adequate knowledge rather than blind reaction. This changes the meaning of resurrection. The story no longer has to function as a historical threat demanding obedience. It can return to its symbolic source. The seed disappears. The plant emerges. Life transforms rather than remaining fixed. The individual participates in processes larger than personal identity. Seen this way, resurrection becomes a human poem about renewal. A person can value the symbol without surrendering reason to the institution, claiming exclusive ownership of it. The image can illuminate without commanding. It can express hope without pretending to prove an exception to nature. This is what happens when the machine becomes visible. The believer was told that the empty tomb created a debt. A God died for you. A God rose for you. Therefore, you owe belief, loyalty, worship, and submission. Questioning becomes ingratitude. Doubt becomes rebellion. Disobedience becomes evidence of corruption. The emotional account can never be paid in full. Spinoza breaks this structure by refusing the original transaction. Nature is not a ruler making bargains. The universe does not demand praise. Reality does not become offended. A storm does not punish. A disease does not judge. Death does not accuse. Events follow from causes. This view may initially feel colder than religion because it removes the human-like guardian from behind the world. But it also removes the cosmic tyrant. Nature does not love you in the personal way a parent might. Yet nature does not hate you. It does not design suffering as a lesson specifically for you. It does not send disaster because your thoughts were impure. It does not threaten eternal punishment for intellectual honesty. The release from divine favoritism is also a release from divine persecution. You are part of the order, not the target of it. From this perspective, the deepest form of joy is not a prize granted after obedience. Joy emerges when the mind moves from confusion toward understanding. To understand a cause is to become less helpless before it. To understand an emotion is to become less controlled by it. To understand a myth is to become less vulnerable to those who use it as a weapon. Spinoza's eternity also differs from ordinary promises of endless personal duration. Most people imagine eternal life as the continuation of the present self, the same identity, memories, relationships, and consciousness extended forever. Spinoza's view is more difficult. Eternity is not simply time without an ending. It is a way of understanding reality beyond the narrow perspective of the temporary individual. When the mind understands something truly, when it grasps necessity, causality, and the larger order of nature, it participates in knowledge that is not merely personal. The body remains finite. The personality remains finite. But understanding touches what does not depend on the private story of the ego. This is not the resurrection most people were promised. There is no restored body walking from a tomb. There is no guarantee that the autobiographical self continues forever. Yet there is liberation in recognizing that the self was never as separate as it imagined. You are not a sealed object placed inside the universe. You are an expression of the universe. Like a wave, you possess a temporary form without being separate from the water that forms you. The wave begins. The wave rises. The wave disappears. But the ocean is not diminished. This metaphor does not prove immortality. It changes the question. Instead of asking how the isolated ego can be preserved forever, it asks whether isolation was ever the correct description of existence. Perhaps the fear of death becomes absolute only when the self imagines itself as a private kingdom. Perhaps understanding unity does not abolish grief, but it removes the fantasy that nature has committed a personal betrayal. This is where the resurrection story ceases to be merely an argument about ancient history. It enters your life. How many choices have you made because you were afraid of death? How much authority have you granted to people who promised certainty? How many questions have you silenced because the possible answer threatened your hope? And what would remain of your spiritual life if fear were no longer allowed to decide what is true? Return now to the beginning. You were told that resurrection was an exclusive signature, a mark appearing once in history, attached to one divine figure and administered by one religious institution. But the historical landscape is more crowded. Osiris passed through murder and restoration, becoming Lord of the Dead and the model of afterlife for his followers. Dionysus was torn apart and reborn, while his mysteries promised initiates a transformed destiny beyond death. Tammuz descended beneath the earth, was mourned by women, and returned with the cycle of fertility. Attis died beneath a sacred tree, was mourned during a spring festival, and became connected with blood, purification, and rebirth in the Roman world. Adonis, the divine lord, died young, entered the underworld, returned seasonally, and was represented through gardens that sprouted and withered. Baal was swallowed by death, while drought consumed the land, and returned when death was defeated through imagery drawn directly from the harvest. These traditions are not identical in every detail. Some involve restoration. Some involve seasonal return. Some describe continued existence in the underworld. Some develop their clearest resurrection language relatively late. Honesty requires these distinctions. But honesty also requires acknowledgement of the pattern. Long before Christianity, human communities connected divine death with agricultural renewal, sacred mourning, personal salvation, and hope beyond the grave. Resurrection did not first enter human imagination as a courtroom report. It rose from the field. It emerged from the seed placed beneath the soil. It grew from the terror of famine. It developed from the human refusal to accept that everything loved must disappear without remainder. Then institutions inherited the symbol. Institutions rarely leave universal symbols untouched. They define them, regulate them, attach boundaries to them, and claim authority over their meaning. A natural image becomes doctrine. A shared human longing becomes membership. A poem becomes a contract. The returning spring is placed behind a gate, and the institution declares that only its authorized representatives possess the key. This is the trap Spinoza helps us recognize. The problem is not that people create symbols. Human beings cannot live without symbols. Language itself is symbolic. Art, memory, ritual, identity, and community all depend upon meanings that exceed literal objects. The problem begins when a symbol is presented as an unquestionable historical weapon. Believe, or you will be condemned. Submit, or you will lose eternal life. Accept our interpretation, or death will defeat you forever. At that point, hope becomes leverage. The deepest human fear becomes a political resource. You do not have to hate believers to see this. You do not need to mock Jesus. You do not need to treat every priest as a conscious manipulator or every act of worship as ignorance. Spinoza's method requires understanding rather than hatred. Hatred is another passive emotion. It binds the critic to the object of criticism. The goal is not to exchange devotion for contempt. The goal is to see causes clearly. Why did the resurrection pattern emerge? Nature supplied the image. Mortality supplied the fear. Imagination built the story. Community preserved it. Institutions organized it. Power regulated it. Once these causes become visible, the mystery changes form. The empty tomb no longer stands over reason as a threat. It becomes one expression of an ancient human attempt to face disappearance. The buried seed returns as grain. The grain becomes bread. The dead god becomes life. The believer sees personal hope inside the pattern. There is beauty in that. But beauty does not require monopoly. A symbol can remain meaningful even after it loses exclusivity. Spring belongs to no church. The seed belongs to no priesthood. The cycle of loss and renewal belongs to no doctrine. Every culture that watched the earth die and return had access to the same source. Christianity did not invent human longing. It gave that longing one powerful form. The difficulty begins when one form declares every earlier form counterfeit, and itself historically incomparable. Then the critical questions must be asked. Where is the absolute exception? Where is the pattern that had no precedent? If gods were already dying and returning in the ancient world, what exactly proves that one later story came from outside nature? If sacred meals, divine blood, rebirth, mourning women, grieving mothers, dying vegetation gods, and promises beyond death already existed, why were believers taught that the Christian configuration appeared in complete isolation? And if the repetition can be explained through agricultural cycles, cultural exchange, psychological fear, and political authority, what remains unexplained that requires supernatural interruption? These questions do not settle every historical debate. Ancient evidence is incomplete. Texts were edited. Traditions changed. Rituals differed from city to city. Myths cannot always be dated with precision. But uncertainty is not a reason to retreat into dogma. It is a reason to think more carefully. The institution demands certainty because certainty protects authority. Reason accepts degrees of probability. Reason distinguishes resemblance from proof. Reason refuses exaggeration but also refuses convenient ignorance. Spinoza's philosophical courage lies in his refusal to let emotional need determine reality. You may want personal immortality. That desire is understandable. You may fear separation from those you love. That fear is deeply human. You may find comfort in the image of a God who enters death first and opens a path through it. That comfort is real. But none of these emotions can establish historical truth by themselves. A comforting belief may be true. It may also be false. Comfort does not decide. Fear does not decide. Authority does not decide. Understanding must examine causes, evidence, language, and the hidden emotional pressures shaping judgment. This is not an attack on hope. It is an attempt to free hope from control. You do not lose renewal when you understand its agricultural origin. You recover it. You do not lose Jesus when you recognize that his story emerged in a world of older symbols. You remove the monopoly placed around him. You do not lose the meaning of resurrection. You gain the freedom to ask what resurrection means when it is no longer used as a demand for obedience. Perhaps resurrection is the mind rising from fear. Perhaps it is the moment inherited belief becomes examined understanding. Perhaps it is the return of intellectual courage after years of silence. Perhaps the tomb is not only a place where bodies are buried. Perhaps it is also the place where questions are buried because communities are afraid of their answers. And perhaps the stone moves when the mind finally says, without hatred and without fear, now I understand the mechanism. Once the mechanism is seen, it cannot exercise the same power. The promise may remain beautiful, but it can no longer threaten. The symbol may remain moving, but it can no longer demand submission. The story may remain part of culture, memory, art, and personal identity, but it no longer owns the conscience. That is the final movement. 6 gods entered death. 6 traditions imagined return. But the true rising at the end of this examination does not belong to Osiris, Dionysus, Tammuz, Attis, Adonis, Baal, or even to the figure at the center of Christianity. It belongs to the person who understands. It belongs to you when fear no longer chooses your beliefs. It belongs to you when inherited certainty gives way to honest examination. It belongs to you when you recognize that no institution has the right to convert mortality into obedience. The tomb becomes empty in a new sense, not because nature has broken its order, but because the mind has escaped the enclosure built around it. The resurrection is no longer a chain. It becomes a symbol of intellectual awakening. And now the final question is yours. If the same promise of death and return appeared repeatedly across thousands of years, who benefited from convincing you that only one institution possessed it? Reflect on that question. Share your conclusion with honesty rather than anger. And if this kind of philosophical examination helps you see familiar beliefs with clearer eyes. Subscribe for the next exploration. The purpose is not to destroy meaning, it is to understand where meaning comes from. Because when understanding rises, fear loses its throne, and for the first time, the mind belongs to itself.